Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Butterworth. I'm the director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media in the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin, and welcome to the third in our series of 6 virtual town hall meetings. We're excited to have you join us here today for our session called Sports History and Memory During a Time of Crisis, which we hope will give us an opportunity to talk about the different ways that sports can be a resource for trying to generate community, trying to manage the anxieties that are brought on by crisis. So we have a great lineup of some really terrific folks today. And so let me start us off by introducing them each one at a time. So we start with Dr. Meredith Bagley. Meredith is an associate professor at the University of Alabama, where she is interested in rhetorical theory and criticism, sports culture, and identity. And one of the great things about Meredith is that if you have the pleasure to visit with her in Tuscaloosa, she can provide you an alternative tour of the university campus that includes the histories of marginalized communities there. Meredith, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Also, UT alum, Hook 'em Horns.
PhD alum of University of Texas at Austin. I should not have neglected that. Thanks for reminding us of that. Excellent. All right, so next up is Marta Crilly. Marta is an archivist for the city of Boston, and she also teaches courses on community outreach with respect to archives and memory at Simmons University in Boston. And Marta also was involved directly with collecting the memorializations that were left in the city in public spaces in the wake of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. So Marta, wonderful to have you here.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Next is Dr. Daniel Grano. Dan is a professor of communication at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, where he is interested in rhetoric, media, and sports culture. He's the author of The Eternal Present of Sport, Rethinking Sport and Religion. And I have to put in the shameless self-promotion that Dan and I have co-edited a book together called Sport Rhetoric and Political Struggle. Dan, great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Next up is Andrew Marinas. Andrew is a distinguished and award-winning writer. He is also affiliated with the Vanderbilt University Sports and Society Initiative. His most recent book is called Games of Deception, and that book is about the first U.S. Olympic basketball team, which happened to take place during the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Andrew, great to have you here. How are you?
I'm doing great, Michael, and I'm a proud Austin High School Maroon alum.
We have many, many Austin connections here today. So yes, welcome back virtually, at least.
All right, thank you.
And next up is Angel Rodriguez, who also has a Texas connection. Angel is a University of Texas alumnus, a graduate in history, but has gone on to a distinguished career in journalism. He's been with the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Washington Post. He's also been with ESPN. He joined the Los Angeles Times in 2015 as its sports editor, and now is in a managing editor role in the newsroom. Angel, great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. Hook 'em.
And we'll make sure we get that in there. And we also do have Dr. Lou Moore. Dr. Moore is at Grand Valley State University, and Professor Moore is a sports historian interested especially in civil rights history. His most recent book is called We Will Win the Day, which is a history of civil rights for African-American athletes in the United States. Unfortunately, Lou is having some technical concerns, but he's there now just as we got to that. So that's outstanding. Lou, thanks so much for making it in. How are you?
I'm good. As everyone can see, I'm on my wife's computer. So that is
whatever it takes.
There, and I don't know how to change anything. So we had some problems, but here I am.
We're all here. That's terrific. Whatever it takes. The rules have been completely rewritten in these last couple of months, so we're all good there. And Lou, it turns out that's perfect timing, because I'm actually going to start with you and then obviously open it up to everybody else here. And again, we have so many possible things that we could talk about here, but we're going to start by focusing on the ESPN 10-part series, The Last Dance, which of course was scheduled to be released later in the summer and would have been a big deal under any circumstances, but has taken on a lot more significance here. And so let's open the conversation by thinking about why it is that we are so inclined to turn to particular kinds of histories, and what is it about The Last Dance that makes it so compelling at this particular moment when we're looking for sports entertainment?
Yeah, look, I think on the one hand, what it does is shows us that sports brings us together. I'll say more about how it blinds us, but I think the narrative around The Last Dance is this great conversation we had, especially when we talk about memory, about kind of how great 90s basketball was, 80s basketball was. But I think the larger thing that we see with The Last Dance is just sports in general, how it serves to really unite us under this kind of supposed American values that we have about like hard work and dedication to your craft, and this idea that if you do these things, you'll succeed. And I think that's why people really embrace like Michael Jordan. And I think these last two episodes speak to that, right? Like I look at him as like toxic and problematic. It's like, man, I wouldn't want to work with him. But so many other people are looking at Jordan like, yeah. And I think they identify with that because somehow we've been brought up to believe, right? If you just do those things, you'll succeed. And it's okay no matter what happens as long as you succeed. And I think that's what's working here with The Last Dance, that kind of common narrative that we see with sports about. There's some other stuff that we'll get into later, but I think that's where we're at with that.
Yeah. One thing I would add is that in a time of crisis, I think a documentary like that, Last Dance, brings us some comfort in going back in time and seeing some familiar faces and hearing some familiar voices and maybe different uniforms even and colors that bring back these memories of a time that maybe felt a little bit safer or was in our youth, you know. And I think there's an element to that as well. I've noticed even friends starting like sim baseball leagues with players from the 1970s and 80s and looking for ways to go back in time to maybe a more comforting time during these times of stress.
It occurs to me that's interesting that it's a documentary that's kind of really captured our emotional attention, not a feature film or a fictionalized. So as much as there's choices in the narrative structure of a documentary, that purported sense of realness, I think Andrew hit it on the head, of that comforting sense of going back to a thing that was true, that did happen. In our general disbelief of what's happening right now, a documentary might really touch into a particular need there in a way that a fiction film, you know, a Star Wars or a sci-fi thing may not. So the purported realness, I think, is an aspect of its attraction.
We've got a couple of, or I guess three, additional documentaries that ESPN has begun to promote, one of which is about Lance Armstrong, another about the summer of 1998 and the home run race between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. And both of those are fairly troubled narratives. Angel, let me turn to you to start us with that one. How do we reconcile our interest in these stories with the reality that we know that both of those, in the cases that I mentioned, have some pretty troubling undertones?
Well, I think you look at it, and that conflict is inherent in what makes things interesting, right? I mean, Michael Jordan is a somewhat conflicted character as well in terms of how he treated his teammates and the different things. And even out here, being in Los Angeles, we had, you know, it was already, I think we were already a little bit predisposed out here to be a little nostalgic because of the Kobe death, and people were looking back on Kobe, and that's another one that's problematic with the sexual assault allegations against him. And so I think these stories just sort of resonate with people because you're going to want to see, like with The Last Dance, for example. I was anxious to see how they were going to deal with the death of his father and how they were going to deal with the gambling allegations and those things. And so with Lance Armstrong and the home run race, I mean, those things, you're just anxious to see how some of these moments that you remember, and the conflict that you remember, how it's dealt with and potentially how it has evolved, and the new stories that you might get out of it that might change your perspective of how that happened. So I think again here specifically in LA with Kobe being with the accident, I think people were already very nostalgic, and we're already looking back on the teams that won with Kobe and Shaq. And so this was just, this happened. It was interesting because the day we had our first coronavirus case in California, the day of Kobe's helicopter crash. So those two things here, it was a very weird day in the newsroom because it was also the night of the Grammys. And so we were all, it was all just one news story after another. And so those, I think here specifically in this region, and potentially for Laker fans and fans of 90s and 2000 basketball, I think it sort of just collided in the sense of how it all sort of related.
Yeah, I think we have a tendency to assume that in times like this, our sports memories need to be pure and comforting. But I think what we're seeing is actually there's a desire to think through and re-experience crisis to try to figure out this moment. And pop culture in general. My Netflix queue when this all started, all the recommends were apocalypse movies. And there's kind of like a way to rehearse your way through the crisis, the aftermath, and maybe some form of resolution. It's interesting that our sports memories that we're turning to right now are complicated ones.
As a footnote to that,
Dan, let me,
I do think
I'm sorry to step on you there, Meredith, because I want to use that to maybe transition us to thinking a little bit about the kinds of crisis and the way that sports will fill that. But I don't want to miss what Meredith was going to say. And then after that, I want to invite Marta to jump in on something specific. But go ahead, Meredith.
no, I agree with what the Angel and Dan said. And I just noticed, I think the third one is the Women's World Cup '99 team. I might have seen a promotional trailer. And so, as early as 6 years ago, we were starting to be critical of that team. Did they hold on too long and prevent the development of the next generation? And now with all the success, there's a lovely, kind of secession story, but I'm wondering how complicated they'll let that story go. It has plenty of dark sides they could go into, or they could keep it a happy success story. So we'll see how that kind of pans out, the gender and sexuality and kind of wrinkles in there they could play out.
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe that's even the fourth one, because I think Bruce Lee is the subject of one of the additional ones as well. But our town hall a couple of weeks ago was specifically about women in sports media and the absences that are being exacerbated in this moment of crisis. So to what extent will the memory of '99 fill in for the ways that we continue to neglect the current U.S. women's national team is a great question. If we're thinking about crisis in particular, one of the things that we're seeing a lot of references to is that sports helped us navigate our way out of previous tragedies, previous crises. 9/11 is perhaps the most common reference point, but Marta, let's turn to you in the city of Boston for a moment. In 2013, after the Boston Marathon bombing, there were lots of ways that the city did respond to that, but sports played an important role. And so what, in the archival work that you've done, what have you discovered about that role?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. So the marathon bombing targeted a sporting event. And so perhaps appropriately, much of the outpouring of unity and support that happened both within Boston and also globally took place via other sporting events. So something that we really observed both at the memorial and in the types of things that were sent to City Hall was that people around the country and even globally were holding races to raise money for the One Boston Fund, which was a fund to benefit bombing victims. And so City Hall received thousands of items from those races. People sent in photos, they sent in running bibs, they sent in the t-shirts they ran in, they sent in their medals. We also saw many people actually making kind of pilgrimages to the memorial. The memorial was in Copley Square from about the time of the bombing, which was April 15th, until late June. And so people actually came and they left their sneakers, their medals, their t-shirts, different things that they had made. And so we saw running and races as both acts of support and also acts of memory.
One thing that I think is interesting in thinking about the Boston Marathon and 9/11 is the way that the rest of the country sort of did come and try to show support for those cities. I remember people saying we're all New Yorkers, or Major League Baseball players who you would think hated the Yankees or hated the Red Sox, wearing those caps, versus today, where in Marietta, Alabama, here I'm in Nashville, you hear voices of people saying, basically New York's on their own, why should we support them? People with the polarization that has spilled over. And I wonder if we would see the same sort of outpouring of support nationally for those teams from cities that have been hit especially hard by the coronavirus.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I would be interested to see that. We received a lot of mail at City Hall and a lot of things at the memorial that said we are all Sox fans today, and these are things coming from New York. Yeah, and I think it will be interesting in 10 or 20 years to be able to look back and see how the response to this crisis differs from the response to the bombing in 2013.
Yes.
One of the things that's striking about some of those examples, if we think about the Boston bombing, the response to Hurricane Harvey and the Houston Astros winning the World Series in 2017, before that story has been soured by subsequent news, the role of college football at Alabama after the Tuscaloosa tornado, and of course Katrina, and the stories about the New Orleans Saints, is in those localized communities. It seems that there's a particular kind of story that we can tell about how sports have helped those communities. The question sometimes becomes then, how does that story get translated to the nation as a whole? In other words, to what extent are these isolated communities representative, and is there a danger in using those particular stories to try to speak for the nation as a whole? Dan, I'm gonna just to make sure I get us started somewhere, I'm gonna turn to you just because of some of the work you've done with respect to the New Orleans Saints and Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, I think that probably the main difference is the Saints or the Red Sox could in some way become representative of the nation as a whole because it happened in such a local context, like you said, whereas coronavirus, COVID-19, is happening potentially to all of us. And there are things that we can do at a regional and state level to affect one another. It's a really unique situation that, like Andrew said, the idea that we're all in it together is facilitated by a localized tragedy, not as much by a pandemic, as it turns out.
Yeah, I can talk to that. I was at UA when the tornado came through. It was my first year as faculty, so I learned a lot about tornadoes fast. We won a national championship in football that fall, and it was very emotional and very moving to see the community do what it did, coming together and helping and things. But of course, there's always lines of fracture, and also I want to talk a little bit about lines of commercialization that happen in these moments. The houndstooth logo that we're so famous for, Bear Bryant's alleged hat pattern, although he wore lots of hats. But the houndstooth pattern can be used in affiliation with the University of Alabama varsity sports only with express permission of the Bryant family. And so you had club teams and kind of even like intramural flag football groups, but definitely I know the men's rugby club that on our team wanted to wear houndstooth shorts all fall to express support, and they were gently, firmly told that was not allowed, and the Bryant family had not permitted that one. The Bryant family allowed a bunch of other spots, patches and things and whatnot, but this interesting thread of commercial control and kind of image and likeness control came through. And I think we could watch that a little bit in this one, right? I mean, do you buy a MLB merch face mask from your favorite team, or do you buy it from a local business who's struggling in your town? Like, how do we kind of pull through the threads of profit in the wake of tragedy also?
Yeah, I think, and that opens up some opportunity for us to comment on, as you put it, the fault lines. Some of the other ways that the comfort that we find in these narratives might obscure the reasons why those narratives are limited. Lou, let's come back to you because you alluded to earlier on saying that there were some things about the Jordan presentation in particular I know it's The Last Dance. It's about the Bulls, but everybody thinks of it as the Jordan documentary. You want to extend that and tell us a little bit about what you had in mind with that comment?
Well, just in sports in general, right? This idea that it brings us together. Like, for example, the Saints, right? Post Katrina, everybody remembers that the year later that Falcons game, everyone's rooting for them. But what I think it does is this idea of let's just get sports, we get our normal life back together, is that return to normalcy is problematic because it doesn't allow us to have these conversations about these inequalities. Right? And I think if we study New Orleans, there's mass inequalities, but the idea that we got to get together and we got to celebrate the Saints doesn't allow us to deal with these same inequalities that come up again in the COVID world in New Orleans. Or in Boston, this idea that you're Boston strong. Well, a couple of years ago, there's that published report that if you're Black in Boston, economically, you virtually have no money. And so this idea of who we are, I think sports then, this idea we need to get back to that, really doesn't allow us to tackle inequalities or this upcoming football season, right? And Los Angeles has another $1 billion stadium, right? And what happens to that Inglewood neighborhood? Like, so we're so quick to want to get the football, but we don't want to talk about what's coming when that new stadium comes and people come there. What happens with gentrification in Inglewood? So that's what I really want to point out. Last Dance specifically, one, there should have been more Dominique, but I would just say to point out, if we want to talk about inequalities, where the Bulls played, they played right next to a project, right? They and that's kind of not talked about, this idea that here you have this stadium, you have these millionaires, and then you have this kind of pocket of poverty right there that sports never really addresses.
Yeah, something that really strikes me about Last Dance is it mirrors Jordan's career in a lot of ways, in that it strives to be apolitical. It's memory without politics. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's really appealing to us right now. If we're going to escape into a documentary, why not, do one around somebody who is a flawed character because of the way he treats his teammates, but carves out a space that's utterly apolitical.
Well, and one of the most striking absences from the documentary is in the one moment where thus far they've been willing to talk about politics, the famous Republicans buy sneakers too comment. There's a really great opportunity to talk about Craig Hodges, Jordan's teammate, who was explicitly political, and Hodges is, as he's now gone on record, had already been on record, but he's nowhere to be found, among other people who are nowhere to be found there. Let me ask, again, this is for anybody, are there other examples of that kind of erasure that we see when we're talking about the stories of sports lifting us out of these community tragedies?
Something that we saw at the Marathon Memorial that was very interesting and also very difficult, and it was something that we didn't discuss much in the press at the time, was that not everything that was left at the memorial and not everything that was sent to City Hall was positive and inclusive and in a spirit of solidarity. There was a really wide spectrum of messages left at the memorial, and while I would say the majority of those messages were unifying, there were a significant number that were xenophobic, that were anti-immigrant, that were anti-Muslim, et cetera. There was a moment in which David Ortiz from the Red Sox at a Red Sox game had kind of grabbed the microphone and said, "This is our effing city." And we saw that written on a lot of Ortiz jerseys and left at the memorial. And often that was said in a spirit of kind of unity and community solidarity, but we also saw that quote used in a way that was exclusive or xenophobic. And so I think that just goes to show that the bombing was very complicated, the aftermath was very complicated, the memorial was very complicated. And sometimes I think when we look at the memorial and the expressions of unity and solidarity, some of that complexity and some of those problematic moments get erased.
I think you see examples of that in the desegregation of sports in the South. Also, if you think about James Meredith's enrollment at Ole Miss as a moment of crisis in the state of Mississippi, that very week, the governor of Mississippi takes the field at an Ole Miss football game and uses sports as a way to try to unify his segregationist base by how much he loved the state of Mississippi and its traditions, which was definitely a loaded statement, as the Confederate flags are waving in the crowd. And so using sports to unify, but not in a way that we would see as a positive way.
Yeah, and I think, Lou touched on it perfectly in terms of the issues we're dealing with out here, specifically in Inglewood with gentrification. And it's not just the new Rams and Charger Stadium, but it's the new Balmer Arena for the Clippers that is in the process of getting done, which the LA Times has looked at closely because there is a parcel of land that has some homes on it, has some businesses on it, that is a parking lot for the new Clippers arena. And that obviously, being out here in LA with the Chavez Ravine and the Dodger Stadium issues from the past, everyone sort of looks at that and is like, oh, is this going to happen again? And so the gentrification and the sort of the disenfranchisement of those populations in a city like Inglewood is and in other cities that, around the country that are going to be building stadiums in urban areas, I think is going to be is another thing that we just have to look at. And especially here, the huge amount of income inequality, which is just going to be heightened by this crisis. And, we're dealing with it specifically with the large homeless population here in Los Angeles as well. It's like there's limits to where, downtown Los Angeles has gone through, if you want to call it a renaissance, in the last 10, 15 years. But, there's only so much that you can do to move these sort of populations out of areas that the city leaders want to sort of heighten and play up. And I think with the Olympics coming in 2028 again, I think we're just going to see that happen even more as well.
I was thinking, Mike, about the title of our group today and the kind of coming together, and how do you come together when in this current moment, right? So which led me thinking about security, and sort of a post 9/11 or post bombing, we had a kind of a militarization of the sports space, lots of security forces, lots of screening and metal detectors and things and we certainly profiled what we thought was that threat person who might come back to the marathon or to the baseball parks. What is that going to look like? Can we come together, right? We're hearing news about broadcast piping in crowd noise to make up for that personal presence. And then if we do, what does security look like? Who are we going to imagine as the bad guy that we have to keep out of our sports spaces to thus come together and feel good, right? Who are we going to try and screen out as we move into the present or near future, I guess, of this particular little myth that we're in?
That certainly might speak regrettably to some of the things that Marta was observing about Islamophobia after the Boston bombing. We certainly know that we're getting increased reports of anti-Asian sentiments in various places. And I don't want to try to speculate that that's going to be something that will happen at a sporting event, but you do worry that our collective responses to these issues could be performed in that way. We're not surprisingly, this kind of a conversation can go by very quickly. We're already at we're almost the bottom of the hour. And one thing I would like to hear from each of you as we move toward wrapping up the conversation is we know what kinds of narratives we tend to look to. The 1980 men's hockey team, sports after 9/11, the things that we've been talking about in this conversation. What are the stories that you would like us to turn to if you had that opportunity? Whether it's the same story that we are already talking about, but you'd like to see it done in a different way, or are there particular memory resources that we should take advantage of that we're not? I threw that one on you, so you may need a second to ponder that one. But
yeah, I was hoping you wouldn't call on me first because I was drawing a blank. So,
Michael, I'll give it a shot. You mentioned at the start my book on the first Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany, and I think the one thing I think about from that book, the context of what we're talking about today, is the tendency we have to look back on events and assume that there must have been unity to help make it through that crisis. And there wasn't even unity in going to Hitler's Olympics in the United States. You might think we all believe we're going to go over there and show him a thing or two, right? But you had preponderance of the country that was in favor of going, that was quite a bit of anti-Semitic sentiment in the country at that time that had no problem going to Hitler's country for the Olympics. You might think, that African-American and Jewish athletes would have been primarily opposed to going to Berlin for those Olympics. And for the most part, they felt like the best thing they could do at that time was to go and to perform well. And that would be the best way to show Hitler that his Aryan supremacy was false. And so I think a lot of assumptions that we make about the way people unified in moments of crisis as it relates to sports are really not true if you examine them closely in retrospect.
My mind goes to Katrina because I've looked at it closely enough, and my concern is we write the story of the recovery the way that we did with Katrina without attending to the unevenness of the tragedy in the first place, and then the unevenness of the recovery according to privilege. And so the poor and people of color having untold stories while the nation, quote unquote, moves on is a depressingly familiar possibility for when sport reopens.
I'll jump in just to piggyback on that and just say just more deep dives into really the inequalities that surround sports. So if we're going to use the stadiums, for example, more on Inglewood, more on what's going on around New Orleans, or if it's building for the Pelicans or something like that. If we're talking about the sports docs, it was brought up before, that 99 soccer team. Like, we have to really ask ourselves, why are the 3 ones that they're throwing out are really centered around this idea of man and manhood and what it means. So I know for sure if they're leaving out that Flojo doc too, right? You have this opportunity to show any doc you have in your vault, and they're choosing the ones to highlight McGuire, Sosa, Armstrong. And now the Bruce Lee one's going to be great. I just hope so, right? But it's just what they have in common. And I think for sports to truly serve its purpose 2020 and beyond, it's really using it as a lens to look at these kind of inequalities and do more deep dives on that.
I've been trying to think about anything that would parallel the way the way disease and health, impact sports. And we've had, lots of talks about the concussions. We could go back to that, but I'm thinking about Magic Johnson and some of the reactions to HIV positive diagnoses. And we got to be really careful on that ground. It can go wrong very quickly. I don't know anything about like tuberculosis or the Spanish flu in sports way back then, but something else about disease. I mean, I'm thinking about recommendations for how these leagues are going to get going, and hockey is talking about full face masks, and we're talking about changing the spaces in which players interact to not have them be at risk, in addition to all the fans up there in the stands. But is there something about other infectious disease moments that sport has had to grapple with that we could go back to and see what happened then?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how college athletics deals with this, because it's one thing to ask professional athletes to go to Florida or Arizona and still, even if they're getting 50% less of their pay or 25% less of the pay or whatever it might be, to do that, and you look at the NBA proposal with MGM, where the NBA players would be staying at the Ritz-Carlton or the, different hotels there during that. But with college athletes, they're not getting paid. They're going to be probably used somewhat, if we do have sports, as a little bit of a guinea pig on how this is all going to work in terms of how these guys are going to be able, and women are going to be able to perform, and how the safety issues are going to be. So I think that whole point there of the college versus the pros, because there is a little bit more of a leeway that you have with high paid athletes, as opposed to college students that are hopefully not going to be used disposably.
Yeah, and I would just say that in all of these stories, I think that when we look at the past. We often look to the past for inspiration, but it's probably more helpful to look at the past critically and to really acknowledge the complexities of all of these stories. And I think that really understanding the past and the complexities of the past then helps us to take more meaningful action in the present. Because if we don't understand the complexity of the past, I think we can make kind of ill-informed decisions in the present. So I think with all of these stories, I think they're all valuable, but we just need to turn a critical eye to them.
That offers a really elegant summary of the conversation that we've had here, and that does bring us to the point where we're out of time. I can't thank you all enough, so let me just acknowledge all of our participants one more time: Meredith Bagley, Marta Crilly, Dan Grano, Andrew Marinus, Lou Moore, and Angel Rodriguez. Thank you all so much for being a part of this, and we invite everyone who's watching, either live or after the fact, to tune into our next session in a couple of weeks, which will actually extend some of this conversation by dealing directly with the role of politics during a pandemic in sports. So once again, thank you all so much for being with us. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're not on YouTube anymore, so
Rub my nose.
here. Lou, thanks for diving in, man. I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, Cicely, she makes good points. I like her.
I know that was tempting. That was tempting. These conversations are great, and they go by so quickly, and there's so many different pathways that I would love to be able to linger over. But really appreciate everyone's insight and time, and if there's anything that we can do here at the center to return the favor, don't hesitate to let me know. And then I just hope everybody else, you hang in there and you stay well.
So, be well with
Thank you.
everyone.